Hello and welcome to our discussion of the Advocacy Coalition Framework. I know that this reading was a bit complicated. This framework is a bit complicated. I'm going to try and boil down to the kind of bare bones of what you need to know to understand the importance of ACF and its basic functions here in our policy theories. So the idea behind ACF, the real big, if you want to have the headline idea, is that ACF is a replacement for that policy process model that we talked about at the beginning of the semester, where you have agenda setting, implementation, that whole kind of circle, right? And many of our theories claim that they are going to redo this policy process model. ACF really does take a pretty good stab at it. The big question they're looking at is, how do people mobilize within the larger system and within subsystems that are dedicated to single issues? So ACF recognizes that the policymaking arena is complicated and needs a framework that can encompass many underlying theories. So ACF does not look to say, punctuated equilibrium is wrong or policy feedback theory is wrong. It actually looks to sit over that as a framework that can contain multiple theories with evidence to support those theories. The idea here is that they are responding to this process model that they found to be lacking in a few ways. One is that it does not talk about multiple layers of government, and we certainly in the United States and in other countries as well have to contend with multiple layers of government depending on where you're at. That does not necessarily, that kind of circle or cycle does not contend with decisions that are made in ambiguous circumstances. And they also found that the stasis change, right, status quo versus shock to the system, is not adequately formulated in other models. So ACF seeks to explain these coalitions that form in subsystems, seeks to explain policy learning and how that happens, and then ultimately policy change. When does learning translate into outcomes? So the general premises as we move forward here. One is that there is a policy subsystem that we'll talk about in a minute that is the primary unit of analysis. The second thing is that you need a long-term perspective to understand what goes on in the subsystem and the larger system. And so Advocacy Coalition Framework scholars often argue that it's impossible to disprove the framework because it has not been long enough. The expansive set of actors that are involved within policy systems can be aggregated into these coalitions that we'll talk about in a minute, and that policy designs, the way policy ends up looking, can be interpreted as a translation of coalition beliefs. What are the kind of core beliefs versus secondary beliefs? The idea here is that these assumptions and a general framework allow researchers to better understand and explain what happens in policy making, what it takes to build and maintain a coalition, what policy making or policy change and policy learning really entail. So that's where we get to this giant thing. Word of caution, I hate this flowchart. And it's not so much that I don't believe in ACF or anything like that. It's just this is really not how my brain works. So if you are like me and looked at this and said, what the heck is going on? This is not helpful. Never fear, we're going to try and break this down a little bit. But let me briefly say the key components that we're interested in here. One is this policy subsystem itself. This is where the bulk of the ACF work is done. The other things that become important are kind of what can shock the system and also what is stable within the system. What is stable within the system will create the structures, both long and short term, that lead to the subsystem. When it's presented like this, though, it does look like a bunch of gobbledygook. So let's break it down. The policy subsystem, this is the first area of interest for us. Subsystems are issue-specific networks wherein coalitions compete to dominate policymaking. So here you see two coalitions, coalition A and B, but you can have 3, 4, 5. It's not necessarily A or B. Although in our gun violence debate, you may find it to be very dualistic and that there is an A and a B. These coalitions exist because elected officials essentially hand off policy making to bureaucrats who then engage interest groups and other subsystem participants in what gets done. So we have these coalitions that form around core beliefs and then secondary beliefs. They employ strategies to get the favor of governmental authorities to create institutional rules and ultimately policy outputs and impacts. These coalitions up here are held together by shared policy beliefs, and they develop these strategies to try and win. This language of winning is pretty pervasive in ACF, and they try and win decisions by government authority that reflects the coalition's policy beliefs. So you have these brokers that exist in the middle, although they're not in this one, that mediate the activities between coalitions. You have learning that takes place where coalitions learn from other policies that have been implemented and other evidence presented. And the process of enlightenment does not happen quickly. It happens, over a great deal of time, which means if the policy subsystem is fairly slow to act, the entire system is fairly slow to act as well. A couple of other key features of ACF that I want to draw your attention to, especially since I know the reading gave you a lot to digest. We can kind of break up two facets of this larger thing by asking two questions. Why does policy change not happen? And why does policy, or when does policy change happen? So the first, why does policy change not happen? That's because of these relatively stable parameters. The idea here is that the system resists rapid change. And if these things remain the same and remain stable over time, big change, big shocks to the system of how we do things, that's just not going to happen, right? So when we have kind of the same fundamental structure, same sociocultural value, same constitutional structure, it's going to be hard to make big structural policy change. That said, big change does happen. So ACF asks, when do those things happen? And it says that there are certain types of events that are more likely to make change happen than others, and that policy actors within the subsystem will often use these things, these external subsystem events, to justify their preferred policies. So socioeconomic conditions change, and you say, aha, free college would have solved this. Or changes in public opinion occur, and you say, aha, free college would have solved this, right? You're looking for an in, and any of these changes might justify your preferred policy. So, I don't want to dwell too much on ACF because there's a lot of complications that go there. What I do want to give you are a couple of takeaways. One is that ACF is a complex way of reworking the typical policy cycle that we've become accustomed to, and really delving into those factors that keep policy the same and that change it. But the big focus is on that subsystem and what happens within there, because the beliefs and the change that happens within there really matters when it comes time to have policy change outside of the subsystem. So, like some other theories we've talked about, it does rely on this kind of stasis change model of explanation, but it does so in a much larger framework that tries to be all-encompassing. And it can get complex, and if you want to read more into ACF, I can certainly point you in the right direction. But understanding just its broad framework and applications, I think, is important, and understanding that the really important thing is that policy subsystem, right, where it's that single issue that becomes relevant. So for the discussion circle this week, I want you to talk about that policy subsystem using the ACF language. What kinds of coalitions are active in the response to gun violence? What types of things might ACF have to say about why things have changed and why things have stayed the same? Right? So those kind of three key takeaways that I wanted you to pull from that larger, complex flowchart. How does that work within the context of gun violence? All right, that is all for this week. I will see you on the discussion circles.